Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Maggie Williams. I'm still the director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. Tonight's conversation on medical marijuana will be moderated by Dr. Staci Gruber, director of the Cognitive and Clinical Neuroimaging Core at McLean Hospital. She is associate professor of psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School and the director of the recently launched MIND program, that's M-I-N-D, Marijuana Investigation for Neuroscientific Discovery. MIND is designed to clarify the effects of recreational and most recently medical marijuana on brain structure. Now, millions of Americans and people around the globe rely on Dr. Sanjay Gupta to help them understand complex health issues and advise them on the practice of good health care. Dr. Gupta works as a neurosurgeon at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. He is also assistant professor of neurosurgery at Emory University School of Medicine. On top of that, he's the chief medical correspondent for CNN and a special correspondent for CBS News and a regular columnist for Time magazine, so he must stay in good health. On television and the internet and in his writings, he is a calming voice who gives us the information and reassurance we need during medical crisis and at times of growing healthcare fears. His global presence as the world's primary care physician is a service to millions and a benefit to all. We welcome you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Fast.
Well, I was about to say our esteemed guest needs no introduction, but we've just had an introduction, you see. So my introduction probably would fall flat. I think most of you know exactly who Dr. Gupta is and what he's done, which is rather extraordinary. What many of you may or may not know is that Dr. Gupta launched a groundbreaking documentary called Weed and subsequently Weed 2, entitled Cannabis Madness. And I thought in order to sort of foster and set the groundwork for our discussion tonight, we would actually watch a clip from Weed 2, just in case some of you haven't seen it. Can we have the first clip, please?
I'll open my door. How are you? Hi, sweetheart. How are you?
In his compelling documentary, Weed.
You've looked at the evidence.
There is real science now out there.
He was flat out wrong about weed.
A year-long journey that changed what many of us thought about marijuana, myself included.
I think, we've been terribly and systematically misled.
We used to only picture this. Then we showed you this. Medical marijuana, treating seizures, pain, dozens of other ailments.
Charlotte's doing amazing. Just better and better each month.
But we learned this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.
To ensure
I think we went from about 150 calls a month to over 4,000.
There are still so many issues to be addressed. The federal government says marijuana is among the most addictive drugs with no medicinal value. Many serious scientists say they're wrong.
It's a medicine.
It's the politics of pot, pitting policy against patients. Trapped in the middle, sick, qualified people who want medical marijuana but can't get it because it's illegal.
If you tried to go back to Ohio with Jordan's medication,
We'll be arrested.
All for a plant that you're going to see can work wonders for pain in a grown man, MS in a woman at the peak of her life, and seizures in a little girl. We traveled the globe asking scientists, patients, and policymakers for a solution. I'm Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and this is Weed 2, Cannabis Madness.
So I hope that's certainly intriguing for all of you and makes you want to absolutely go and watch. Oh, no? Never? Oh. So what I was going to say in my introduction that wasn't an introduction was that Weed and Weed 2 have been viewed countless thousands of times online. It's hundreds of thousands of times, actually. And it sparked controversy and discussion among politicians and policymakers, doctors and patients, teachers and students, parents and children, really across the world. So tell us a little bit about what happened with your research. You and I met first a year and a half ago, something like that, when you were researching it.
Yeah. Let me just say thank you for allowing me to be here. And, I love discussions like this. I think that we don't do enough of this sort of discussion in our society. The idea of adults, lifelong learning. I love attending these sorts of things as a observer. So to be here in front of you, it's a real privilege, a real honor. So thank you for that. This is a provocative topic, as Staci mentioned, and my viewpoints on this have evolved over time. When we started to focus on this, and when I first met you a year and a half ago, we were in the process of making a documentary about medical marijuana with no clear idea as to exactly what the documentary was going to look like in the end. I had, like a lot of other topics as a journalist, it was something that I'd covered in various ways for television and also as a columnist for Time magazine. And in the past had written various articles about specific aspects of medical marijuana, most of which were not particularly enthusiastic about its potential. So when we started doing this as well, I wanted to actually delve into it and show where I thought the science stood. And frankly, I didn't think the science was going to show much. And that was sort of the beginning of that journey. And it was one of the best sort of things as a journalist to be able to walk into a topic eyes wide open. And if you're a curious person about this, to be able to travel around the world, talk to the experts who are really on the front lines of this, and at the end of it, create something that I think would hopefully educate people about this issue in an engaging way. That's all that we were thinking at that point. And you were one of our very early interviews in this whole thing.
So I think it was 2006, something like that. You were talking about marijuana and the fact that you didn't necessarily think it was a particularly positive thing in terms of recreational use, perhaps. And then I'm not sure how that dovetailed with medical marijuana, but I think a number of people wonder what made you change your mind, because you had what could be considered a little bit of an about-face about it.
Yeah, I think it wasn't about face. And the background on this was I looked at the literature in the United States on this topic. And a lot of times in the scientific community, we have various resources to look at broad swaths of the literature. And you start to look at all these papers and these abstracts. And in my case, I will spend days sort of going through all these articles and dive deeper into some that I think are particularly interesting, either because of the number of patients involved or the way that the study was conducted. But when I started to look at all of that research in the United States, it wasn't particularly compelling. I mean, it looked like most of the data was really showing what the harmful effects of marijuana was on the body and on the brain. And that was sort of why I was, it informed a lot of my writing on this topic over several years. And the article that I wrote in 2006 was for Time magazine, which was one of their big stories that year, was about, it was on the ballot in several states. Right. I wanted to inform people what the medical literature was showing, and I wasn't particularly compelled by it. Right. What happened in between was that I started to look at literature from other countries. And I started to look at labs that were not funded by the federal government, private labs. And it was interesting because it was easy to dismiss those studies, too easily dismissed. But I think that once I started to look at them and then go visit these places and go visit these countries, a different picture started to emerge. And this is before we shot any film. We hadn't shot anything yet. This is just the background. Oh. And I started to realize that there was probably something a little bit more here. I went and met with the guy who is the father of marijuana research in Israel, a guy named Raf Meshulam, a very prestigious scientist, won the Israeli Prize for Science. At one point, he was the first person to isolate THC. Exactly. He was subsequently able to synthesize THC, and he was starting to do some amazing work still in the whole idea of therapeutics. So as I started to put this together, and then I went and met with patients, I realized that I had, in my own way, probably dismissed many patients as malingerers who were just trying to get stoned. And there are a lot of those people, but there are also a lot of very, very legitimate patients as well, for whom not only did I realize that medical marijuana was working for them, it was working for them when nothing else had. Right. And it took on a different sense of urgency for me, because this now became not just a medical story, this became a medical, social, and political story. Sure. In many ways. And so much about it was hard to understand. How did we get to this point where it was treated as one of the most dangerous substances in the United States. So just real quick, I'll just tell you, going back to the literature in the United States, one thing I realized was that most of the studies that were getting funded in this country were studies that were designed to find harm. So a researcher goes, they apply for a grant, they want federal money, and they also want the substrate, the marijuana, to be able to study. That also came from the federal government. And I think we calculated over about a 12-year period, 4,000 some studies, 94% of them were studies where the hypothesis was, what is the harm?
What's the harm?
And a single-digit percentage were on benefit. And when you looked at it, it was a very distorted picture. It was the picture that I was distorted by, and why I wrote all those articles. And then when I started to dive deeper, that's when the about face started to occur.
Right. So, as a journalist who happens to be a physician, researching this in such a way that you're traveling literally to other countries. I mean, you did an extraordinary amount of research on this topic, really before you ever shot any film, apparently,
right.
Which I didn't know.
Yeah.
Do you see any difference, in your opinion, as a journalist trying to bring a story sort of to the nation, right? Everybody thinks of Dr. Gupta as America's doctor, versus your position as a physician, somebody who's really invested in preventing or treating human suffering?
It's a great question, and it's one of these questions I think sometimes that you're a doc, I'm a doc, and we have these conversations, and I think there's an objectiveness to this, and there's a subjective quality to this as well. Objectively, I felt very comfortable because I think ultimately we live in the world of facts and science and data, and when I started to write about this and wrote the op-ed and things like that and started to put together this documentary, I felt like we were standing on very firm ground with regard to what we were saying. But I'm also a doctor and I'm also a dad.
Yeah.
And nowadays, you got things live forever.
Yes, I've seen that quote, something along the lines of, I would never allow my children, or I would never suggest that my children smoke marijuana.
Yeah, I mean, people make the leaps all of a sudden. If you're talking about this in any way, that means you condone it completely. You're
right.
encouraging young kids to smoke marijuana, all of that sort of stuff. And of course, none of that is true, but that hardly matters sometimes, and what is put out there and lives forever, is
right.
memorialized. That's the subjective nature of this, because I didn't want that either. And also this idea that perception is the reality. I had one of my colleagues, someone I respect very much, come talk to me about this, and we had this long conversation, I'll never forget, where essentially he said, look, we see the science, we're looking at the same papers you're at, and we agree with you. I mean, it seems like it's not only beneficial, but it's filling a void in some particularly difficult areas of medicine to treat, refractory pain and refractory epilepsy and things like that, things that we've had challenges treating in the neuroscience space for a long time. But do you really want to be that guy? Was sort of the question he was asking. Do you want to be the guy who's out there pushing marijuana? Which I wasn't doing. I wasn't pushing it, but it was that whole thing. So that's a challenge, I think. It was of a particular challenge with this topic.
I think for everybody, somehow you're perceived as pushing pot if you're researching pot, right?
That's right.
And of course, the science of marijuana and cannabis is more than just smoking marijuana.
Absolutely, and when you really start, I was intrigued by the fact that people really wanted the science of this. Yeah. What does it do to my brain?
Right.
This stuff, and how does that change as I get older? And I mean, they were asking me questions like, what is a CB1 receptor? Where are they located? And I thought, wow, we're if nothing else, we've elevated the discussion about this in this country.
Which is great. So because you raised CB1 receptors, he said it, I didn't. I think it's a really important thing to remember that people often think of marijuana as one thing. Pot, marijuana, it's one thing, when in fact we know it isn't. What's your feeling about explaining to the public the differences between the constituents in marijuana and how they may exert different effects?
I think a thorough discussion about cannabis, you have to talk about the different components of the plant, and I think there's sort of two parts of that discussion. One is that the different parts of the plant seem to do different things, right. And so the immediate assumption when you talk about this is that somebody is getting high and they're smoking it. And neither one of those things necessarily have to be the case. There are strains of marijuana that seem to have significant medicinal benefit, which don't actually have very little of the psychoactive ingredient. The THC is what makes people high.
Maybe just back up, just in case the audience isn't 100% sure. So THC is considered the main psychoactive component in marijuana, while CBD or cannabidiol is not particularly psychoactive or doesn't make you high.
Right, and so CBD and THC, and CBD seems to have other therapeutic benefits in the body. It was interesting because for a long time I thought that people thought that they were just sort of antagonistic to one another.
Yeah.
You know, CBD would modulate how high somebody became, the feelings of psychoactive euphoria, all of that. But now we realize that there's these receptors in the body to which CBD can bind that could cause these benefits. For seizures, for example, it could actually create a pattern in the brain that would reduce the amount of seizures, decrease the amount of electrical activity in certain parts of the brain. Staci and I were together earlier today talking about the fact that CBD could act as an anti-inflammatory in the brain after someone has had a head injury or a stroke. And what was striking to me was in the context of the fact that this is an illegal substance in the country and defined as being of no medicinal benefit. As part of our documentary, we learned that the Department of Health and Human Services has a patent on components of marijuana for this very purpose, for the idea of actually protecting the brain after a head injury or stroke. So on one hand, you have a situation where it's illegal, no benefit at all, but we're just going to keep a patent just in case. There's been a lot of momentum around that, but there are these different chemicals. The second part of the discussion was the fact that it's probably made up of some 400 chemicals,
Right.
and we don't know what they all do, but they probably all do something. And so the idea of taking out a single ingredient and creating a medicine out of that is understandably desirable, but may not offer the same benefits as the plant itself, a whole plant extract being turned into a medicine, which I thought was intriguing. It goes against the way that we develop drugs in this country.
Exactly.
It's completely different. It may be why there hasn't been much interest in marijuana, this idea that do you patent a plant? I mean, whose is it at that point if you're just taking these whole plant extracts and creating medications out of it? Do you patent the process by which you extract the ingredients? There were all these various questions that came up. One thing we realized is that there weren't a lot of advocates for it within the pharmaceutical industry or certainly within the government.
Right.
And those are some very legitimate barriers.
Right. So some of the studies that we've seen, clinical trials of synthetic marijuana, nabilone or marinol, we have patients that say they don't necessarily feel particularly better after taking it, or they try it. It doesn't do the same thing as when they use it recreationally with a friend. Perhaps it's because it's not distilled from the entire plant. Is it possible that that's why some of the synthetics have not necessarily been as popular, if you will?
I think that's exactly it. And I think that, when you talk to people like Roth Meshulam, who has been studying this for a long time. I think he's in his 80s now.
He's the granddaddy of marijuana
He's the granddaddy
research,
of,
really.
and he's this really mild-mannered guy, and he's so thoughtful when he talks about these things. But the idea that these other compounds in the plant may help transport the more active ingredients to the places in the body that they need to be, the idea that these other compounds can open up a receptor and therefore make the active ingredients work better or more enhanced. Not entirely sure about all that. I will tell you a side story, although you may know this story, but he postulated that we evolved as human beings with this plant, with the marijuana plant.
It's been around since 4000 BC, right? The Chinese used it as medicine.
They use it as a medicine back then, and it was in the pharmacopoeia in this country up until the
42,
40s.
right?
Yeah.
And now it's a class 1 scheduled substance.
Right. We used to have it as a part of the book that doctors would write prescriptions from, and it evolved from that into this Schedule 1 substance. But he said because we evolved with this, it is quite likely that we actually have these cannabinoids in our system already, that we make them in our system. So he was on a quest for some time, as you may know, to find what is the human sort of cannabinoid. Do we actually make this? And he found a substance that actually was a cannabinoid that is made by the human body. And it was interesting because he was in Israel at the time, and he found this substance, and he didn't know what to call it. initially. He wanted to call it substance of supreme bliss. That's what he wanted to call it. And he realized
There's no bias there.
There was no word in Hebrew that meant supreme bliss. He could not, I don't know what it was, there was just no word that actually fit. So he went to the Sanskrit language and found the word ananda, which means supreme bliss, and anandamide is our body's own cannabinoid, which I thought was interesting.
It's very interesting. So after all this research, from your perspective, what do you see as the greatest possibilities currently for medical marijuana in terms of conditions or populations, and what are some of the frustrations or limitations around the research?
You know, I think because I have lived so long in the world of neuroscience, I've been really interested in the idea that some of the medical aspects of marijuana could help treat some of these neurodegenerative and neuro-related things, everything from pain. And the type of pain that I'm talking about is a neuropathic pain. It's the sort of lancinating pain that's pins and needles that oftentimes is caused by an injury to a nerve or a nerve root. I was really fascinated by this little girl that you saw a clip of there, Charlotte Figge, and her intractable seizures. This is a girl who was having seizures 300 times a week. Her seizures were so frequent that her mom would just have her in this baby Bjorn, and she'd carry her around and just feel her seizing all the time, and there was nothing she could do about it. She was tried on 7 different anti-epileptic drugs, all of which were pretty toxic drugs, very sedating, essentially zombified her. They were at the point where they were about to compound a veterinary medication and try and use it in a human for the first time because nothing was really working for her. And her father, who was over in Afghanistan in the military and worried out of his mind for his daughter, just started going on YouTube and saw a clip of somebody using a high CBD, non-psychoactive oil for a kid that had these types of seizures. And he called his wife back in Colorado and said, you know, should we try this?
We actually have that clip.
All right.
And actually, this may be a very good time to show that clip with this perfect introduction. Can we have clip number 2, please?
It was January 2012, Afghanistan. About 7,000 miles away from his family in Colorado, Matt Figge received this video from his wife, Paige.
It's horrible seeing these videos when I'm deployed.
It was his 5-year-old daughter, Charlotte, seizing. Diagnosed with a severe form of epilepsy, she was having 300 seizures a week, each attack so severe it had the potential to kill her. They had already tried dozens of high-powered drugs.
We needed to try something else, and at that point in time, marijuana was that natural course of action to try.
At home in Colorado, Paige searched for marijuana high in CBD. That's the ingredient some scientists think helps seizures, and also low in THC. Remember, she didn't want to get her daughter stoned. She found a small amount at a Denver dispensary. The owner was surprised that anyone would even want it.
They said it's funny because no one buys this, you know. That was the general consensus. Nobody wanted it. It didn't have any effect.
Paige paid $800 for a small bag and took it home.
I had a friend that was starting a business on making medicine. And I said, can you help me extract the medicine from this bag of marijuana? I measured it with a syringe and squirted it under her tongue. It was exciting and very nerve-wracking.
Holding Charlotte in her arms, Paige waited. An hour ticked by, and then another, and then another.
She didn't have a seizure that day. And then she didn't have a seizure that night.
Did you sit there and look at your watch?
Right, I thought, this is crazy. And then she didn't have one the next day. And then the next day. And I thought, she would have had 100 by now. And I just thought, this is insane.
I remember how happy Paige was. Like, it's really working. I can't believe it. Yeah, that was pretty amazing to hear.
So, incredibly compelling video. And in fact, in Weed 1, the footage is unbelievably moving. And for people who haven't seen anything like this, I think it's incredibly important to show them what can happen secondary to treatment. But there are others who say that there's a fair amount of concern in giving marijuana, which again is still a Class 1 substance, to pediatric populations and to children. We're just now seeing the first clinical trial in New York and San Diego. What do you say to folks who are concerned about it?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, you know, Paige and Matt and Charlotte, they're one family, emblematic of hundreds of families. You know, we tell a story sometimes when we do these documentaries, recognizing that the story is important to tell, but it's not just one story, and we, you know, it's not just one anecdotal thing, and we get into that in the documentary as well. So, you know, people walk away thinking, well, it's an isolated case. How could you make that big a deal about this? It's because we kept hearing hundreds of stories like this. With regard to the risk and benefit ratio, which is I think what everybody fundamentally wants to know,
Sure.
and maybe even more so with kids, I think it's a very legitimate question. And you know, I have a 9, 7, and 5-year-old myself, so you know, you couldn't help but think about your own kids a bit when you're making a documentary like this, and you see a kid who's having 300 seizures a week. It's really heartbreaking stuff.
Of course.
But I also knew that she had been on these 7 different medications ahead of time.
None of which had worked.
None of which had worked, and all had significant toxicity.
Right.
And each time a new medication was given, there was a risk-benefit analysis. And to give you an idea of just how toxic some of these medications were, they could cause cardiac problems. Twice, little Charlotte went to cardiac arrest, not from the seizures, but from the medications.
Right.
One time, they were absolutely convinced she was going to die. They called the ambulance. I mean, Paige told me that she basically said goodbye to her daughter, and it was, you know, it's tough to talk about and hear about, but that was their reality.
Sure.
And it was just 300 seizures a week. If you think about that, that's 45 seizures, 50 seizures a day. It's just all the time. So the toxicity, the risk-benefit, you know, sort of analysis was something they had sort of already gone through. With regard to a high CBD marijuana, it didn't seem to be much evidence that it was going to possibly cause an overdose, possibly cause an arrest of her heart or her lungs, her ability to breathe, and it could possibly work. So when people ask me about this thing, I say, you know, there's always potential risks with these medications. I think you have to take in the context of what the risks are of what the person has already tried,
Sure.
and also what the potential benefits are. She was not going to survive this. She was going to die of her disease. And I can tell you, that was near the end of the documentary. You saw some improvements already. She is basically mainstreamed now in school. And you know, you would not recognize her.
This is a child who couldn't walk previously.
A child who couldn't walk, a child who could not function, a child who was not in school, a child who was always on medications, essentially zombified. She has siblings who did not recognize their sibling.
She's a twin, isn't she?
She has a twin. And so it was just, it was incredible. And I went and saw her these past holidays just because, you know, you get close to your people that you do documentaries about, and it's the holidays, and it's kind of funny. She walked right up to me. I didn't know that she'd even remember me, and shook my hand,
Amazing.
this little girl, and took me around to meet all these people in the house, was introducing me to them. It's kind of an extraordinary thing. And she takes this ointment, you saw this oil, still twice a day. It's squirted into her mouth.
Sort of just sublingual under the tongue.
Just under the tongue. It absorbs across the mucous membranes in the mouth, and that's it.
And
no other medications.
Amazing.
It's pretty remarkable.
So she's not an isolated case, and one of the things that comes out in Weed 2 is the fact that there are families, countless families, who are faced with incredibly difficult decisions of what to do because state regulations, of course, are not currently in accordance with federal regulations. What do you see as the greatest hurdle for these families who are desperate to get treatment for their children?
Well, the scenario is pretty remarkable to me, and I wouldn't have believed this if I didn't see it with my own eyes. But you have a situation now because of this federal-state dichotomy, where in the state of Colorado, for example, where we did a lot of our filming, they could gain access to what is now called Charlotte's Web.
Right. Named for her.
Named for this little girl. And it's a strain that they believe can help this intractable epilepsy. But if you go there, take your child there to try this out, and it works, you are stuck because you can't take it with you out of the state. If you take it with you out of the state, you could be arrested for drug trafficking, and that is real. That has happened. And so families who take this oil, that is a high CBD, non-psychoactive oil, and they're transporting it, trying to transport it home, could lose their child, first of all, the child they're trying to help, and they could be put in prison for drug trafficking. So then that's a real problem. So what the situation that has emerged is you have hundreds of families, maybe more now, that have essentially packed up their whole lives and just moved to Colorado. They quit their jobs, they sold their homes, they just moved in order to be able to give their child this thing that works for them. It doesn't work for everybody.
Right.
But there have been a lot of people for whom it has, and they're stuck in this limbo where they just have to, they're medical marijuana refugees living in Colorado, and it's you know, I've met many of them. It's an extraordinary situation.
What do you say to people who say, can we really call marijuana a medicine? There's no accepted guidelines with regard to potency, dose, mode of use, frequency of use. That doesn't necessarily jive with what we know in America as, quote, medicine. But we have, quote, medicinal marijuana laws in the states, you know, in the legislation in each state. What do you say about that? Is it medicine?
Well, you know, and I would love to get your take on this as well as one of the leading researchers in this area, but I will tell you, it's a strange situation. I mean, look, I grew up in the world of, you know, I went to medical school, and I saw how, you know, we prescribe medications, and I saw you know, in the United States, we have a certain amount of expectation when a doctor hands you a prescription for a medication, that this medication is going to be safe, it's going to be effective, it's going to be the best thing for me. I mean, that's an expectation that we just sort of take for granted, I think, in some ways. Marijuana has not gone through that process in this country. We haven't gone through the FDA and done the clinical trials that are large, randomized trials, all those things that you'd want. And yet the states have spoken in 23 states. Where are they? 23, right?
23 plus DC.
23 plus DC.
24.
And said, we understand that's how it's normally done, but we need to fast track it, or we need to do it a different way in this state because we think it needs to be available now. So
policy has sort of outpaced science in this regard.
The policy has outpaced the science. And I think that creates some barriers. What exactly are you getting? What strain should you be using?
Right.
What dose should you be taking? All that sort of stuff. We don't always have answers to those questions, and those are questions that patients, you know, have a legitimate desire to know, and they ask these questions. So it's a bizarre situation. I don't think there's anything else quite like it with regard to a medication in this country.
And there hasn't been anything like it in past history that I can recall.
No, I can't think of anything like it. And I've done lots of interviews where I've talked to the commissioner of the FDA. I've talked to the head of NIDA, which is the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and asked that same question.
Right.
And you get a lot of, well, you know, I mean, it's the states that have made these decisions. And I said, well, why wasn't it you? Why wasn't it the FDA? And I think at some point, what I'm feeling is that the science is going to start to catch up.
Fill the gaps.
It's going to start to fill some of those gaps.
Where do you see the line between recreational and medical marijuana? Do you feel that they're different? Are they perceived by the country in a different way?
I think with regard to recreational marijuana, it's almost been a question of how much perceived harm and how much perceived risk there has been. That's been what's really driven that discussion. So, and the perceived risk, as you well know, has gone down.
Continues to drop every year, and use rates go up. It goes like this. It's very concerning.
As perception of risk goes down, usage rates go up.
Right.
You know, I think we have to, you know, in the media, from the media standpoint as well as the medical standpoint, we've got to educate on both ends.
Right.
We've got to educate on the potential benefits, but also the potential risks. You know, you brought up at the very beginning my own kids. You know, this is not something I'm encouraging children to do. Staci Gruber, Dr. Gruber, has done some of the foremost research on the impact on the brains of young people, the developing brains of young people, and it's pretty compelling to look at that work. And when I look at that research say from a recreational standpoint, a non-medicinal standpoint,
right.
I think there's real concerns about people in particular whose brains are still developing, using this product recreationally. I mean, I think you'd agree with that, right?
I absolutely do, and I think we need a lot more research to understand the real differences between the two. People tend to think that recreational and medical marijuana are somehow the same, and in fact, we need to really clearly delineate the differences because they do exist.
People who are taking recreational marijuana are typically taking strains that are much higher in THC, and they may be taking all sorts of different things, whereas with medical marijuana, they may be taking smaller doses, more consistent strains, things that are designed to achieve a particular benefit.
And not necessarily just to get you high, like most people. may assume with medical marijuana.
I thought it was fascinating what you shared with me today, that people, especially again at a young age, who are using marijuana regularly, recreationally, we can now objectively see some of the changes in their brains.
Yes, we can.
There's the white matter area and the effects of that, right?
We do see changes in white matter in terms of earlier versus later onset of smoking, which is a concern for recreational users, and I always get the question, which is why I posed it to you. Well, what do we think is going to happen with medical marijuana? Will the same thing be the result? And we just don't know yet.
It comes back down to risk-reward again. But I thought it was so interesting to be able to now look at people's brains and say, you know, the old commercials, many of you are probably too young to remember, but it was like, this is your brain, and it was a fried egg, or it was an egg, and then there was, this is your brain on drugs, and it was that egg in a frying pan. Remember that? It was like, what is really happening to your brain? And now, because of some of your work, we know that the white matter in the brain, which is sort of like, think of the white matter as sort of the highways in the brain, the areas that connect the cities of the brain. The important areas that are the gray matter and the gray nuclei of the brain, but they got to transmit signals to different parts of the brain through the white matter. And people who use marijuana early onset, as you call it, at a young age, before the brain was fully developed, tend to have disruptions in the white matter. It just doesn't work as well. The roads get kind of damaged, I guess. There's a lot of potholes.
Lots of potholes, exactly. I think of it as construction that shouldn't be there. Right. There's all sorts of things set up, and it's not going to be a smooth ride. That's right.
And it seems that if you started using marijuana at a young age recreationally, that those potholes are particularly hard to fix, meaning they last longer than you would hope. It's not just a short-term thing. You could have longer-term problems with those roads if you started using marijuana young.
And that's something that we need to look at additionally, sort of what happens when people stop using. Does it come back?
Right.
What do they look like longitudinally? So I could sit here and talk with you all day about this and go through a myriad of questions, but I think at this point I need to open it up to our audience who's been so patient and quiet. And I believe there are some ground rules. Let me see if I can do it without my cheat sheet. There are microphones located on the floor. Now I'll be the flight attendant. On the floor and behind you in the loge. What I'd ask is for each of you to identify yourselves. No, don't identify someone else. Identify yourselves, pose a question, and remember that a question ends in a question mark, okay?
Yeah.
I think of, yeah.
And I just report the news. I don't want to make the news. I hear that this forum has a habit of making some news, so.
Well, it is Harvard.
It is Harvard.
So if anybody have a question for Dr. Gupta?
Or Dr. Gruber.
or me. Yes.
Hi, Jim Kernick. I have a question for you in relation to the unique position of marijuana and the government. Do you know of any other natural product that was part of the pharmacopoeia that was removed without any scientific evidence for its removal?
Great question.
I don't off the top of my head, but you know, it's interesting. I know there have been other substances over time that have been used for medical applications that have subsequently not been, and we have Rick Doblin here in the audience as well, sitting in the back, who has done a lot of work in this area, and we spent some time together today. Ecstasy, in fact, at this university at one time was used to treat PTSD. Is that right, Rick? Is that? Oh, hey, how you doing? And what's the status on that now?
I'm going to be reprimanded if you don't step to the microphone. I can feel it coming from the sidelines. So spare me the castigation.
Well, I'm Rick Doblin. I got my PhD from the Kennedy School here on the regulation of the medical use of Schedule I drugs. So the MDMA study for PTSD is what we're mostly doing. The cancer patient study here, it was difficult to recruit patients because we had to have only 1 year less to live, and people didn't really want to admit that they only had 1 year or less to live. So that was difficult. But my question, basically, Staci, is for you, which is that the big
How did that happen?
the big challenge right now to doing marijuana research is the monopoly that's held by the federal government on the supply of marijuana. And marijuana will never be made into a medicine by private sources as long as NIDA has the monopoly, because their marijuana can only be used for research, not for prescription use. So I'm wondering if you think there might be some way we could get NIDA-funded researchers to appeal to NIDA to say, let's end the monopoly and let privately funded operations grow marijuana, and it's still going to be regulated by FDA, DEA, institutional review boards. It's not like it opens the door to everybody getting marijuana.
I think we're seeing a little bit of a change, and we talked a little bit about this today in terms of things like Epidiolex, which is manufactured by GW Pharma, not a US company, but a UK company. And so for the first time, this drug was granted orphan status, and in fact is in clinical trial, phase 1 clinical trials in kids with pediatric epilepsy in both New York and San Diego. So it's starting. I think there's been some motion, and there's, I believe, a clinical trial funded by NIDA that uses Sativex, also a UK GW Pharma product. So I think the tide is turning a little bit.
Well, that's marijuana grown in Israel now, right? Licensed by the government is grown for 50 cents a gram, $14 an ounce. And so the GW Pharmaceuticals, which has a license to grow marijuana, does not want competition from the plant. And as you've said, Dr. Gupta, that a lot of people do think that there's a lot of value from the plant itself. So I think, do we really want to turn this over entirely to large for-profit pharmaceutical companies, or do we want to let other people, even for-profit and non-profit organizations, grow to research the plant? And I think that's the policy issue that we need to get over, and I think NIDA-funded researchers could help make that happen.
That's a great point. Thank you.
So I actually had a follow-up on that in relation to Dr.
Remember
Goblin's question.
Remember to pose the question.
And what it really is are there other psychoactive substances that we are ignoring because of politics rather than because of science? For example, the MDMA, and there are a lot of other natural substances that have known psychoactive activities. Our pharmacopoeia is full of natural products that we rely on for all kinds of medical therapeutics. And are there other therapies that we should be considering in addition to marijuana?
Yeah, well, look, to be fair, my documentary was all about medical marijuana, so I didn't become an expert on all psychedelics all of a sudden. but I think the MDMA example is a good example. I mean, that the idea that this, people think it's ecstasy, and I think people think of this as purely in the recreational sense. But the idea that there have been trials that have looked at it, and there are ongoing trials now for people who have refractory PTSD. I got interested in this not just because of the medical therapeutics of some of these things, but also this idea, what really became sort of outrageous for me in this whole thing was that a lot of times these people did not have an existing therapy for whatever their problem, whatever ailed them, whether it be epilepsy, whether it be really refractory, debilitating PTSD. These are legitimate problems. We're seeing it with returning veterans now, something else that Rick is working on. But the idea that you have something out there that could potentially offer a benefit when nothing else has, to me was almost a moral outrage as opposed to just the medical component of it. So I'm sure the answer is yes to your question. I mean, the idea that medical marijuana may force us to evaluate the whole drug development system overall, the idea to look at products that maybe don't get a lot of credence because people may think it's a plant, maybe I can't patent it, maybe I can't make money on it, I don't know. I'm not sure what drives all that sometimes, but the...
I have to interrupt you there. There are numerous patented natural products that are in the pharmacopoeia, and to suggest that the pharmaceutical companies won't pursue them because they can't make money because they're from a plant, it's just not true.
Well, it hasn't happened with medical marijuana.
No, I understand, because it's 4,000 years old. You can't patent that plant. But Taxol is a plant that's used in the therapy of breast cancer that comes from a tree. So, I mean, there are many, many. I'm not going to list them all, obviously. But the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in natural products, and they're pursuing them aggressively.
Sounds like
some of them. Yeah.
A perfect way to follow up, I think, once we've sort of concluded this. This sounds like one of those follow-up things that's going to go on for a long time. We can go through all of the list. Actually, so I've been asked to go in a clockwise order. Yes, sir.
That was a very good talk. So I'm Dr. Singh. I'm one of the surgical residents, and because I went to medical school, all my friends think that I know everything about marijuana. And they ask me, like, if you had to rank recreational marijuana compared to alcohol and cigarette smoking, like 1, 2, 3, how do you rank it? And depending on how much beer I had, like, my answer changes. So I want to know what's your take on it.
I've had no beer, just to be clear. You know, these sort of moral equivalence questions, I sometimes, I think you can provide answers on that depending on what you're specifically looking at. Like, how do you answer a question like that in terms of what? How are you comparing it? I mean, if you're looking at it purely from a recreational standpoint, is one better than the other in terms of not creating harm, or what is it? You know, and I'm not asking you to answer that because I think everyone asks the question and hoping to elicit a different response. So, you know, I don't know. I tried marijuana once. I didn't particularly care for it. It made me really anxious. And I'm kind of like, I like to be in control of my environment, and I'm an athlete, and I just, you know, it wasn't for me. So is that a good thing for me? No. Do I have an occasional beer? Yes. You know, so I think it was a distraction from what we were really trying to talk about with regard to medical marijuana, which is, you know, some of this other discussion about the fact that this could be a legitimate medicine, which for whatever reason, you know, whatever the reasons may be, has not been legitimized in a way that I think maybe it should have been for quite some time. And I think a lot of people got hurt or did not get the treatment that may have benefited them. And that's really where I focus my attention. I mean, the idea of, it comes up in one context, which is that if this does become a legitimate medication more widely used, then what about things like driving? You know, if someone is taking this as their medication, can they still drive? You know, you can't drive when you've been drinking, but you know, so I think those are fair questions to ask. But just as a recreational thing, I don't know. Do you have an opinion on that?
I think actually your point about driving is a hugely important one, because for the first time, according to the Monitoring the Future study just this last year, high school seniors reported having driven just after smoking marijuana more frequently than having gotten behind the wheel after drinking. It's the first time that's happened. So it's really something to be paying attention to in terms of the ultimate impact. Thank you for the question. Dr. Halpern.
Yeah, hi, John Halpern, Director of Laboratory for Integrative Psychiatry at McLean Hospital, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Just a very quick comment, but a couple of questions. The quick comment is just about, Staci, about medications that don't have dosimetry built into it. So when we have a patient with cluster headache and we tell them to inhale oxygen, it's to effect. We don't tell them, you have to inhale 1,000 liters. So we have medications that are exactly the same as what occurs right now with marijuana. Moreover, tincture of opium, which all of the constituents of which have not been identified, is a prescribable medication in the United States, though rare. Methamphetamine, a drug of abuse. Well, the blue stuff down into 5 milligrams is called Dizoxin and is a brand name medication. So we have the ability to both understand how a drug can be used and abused. So I have a couple questions. The first one is I'd love to hear, Sanjay, your opinion about this bizarre thing that the FDA issued in the final years of the final Bush administration, this strange report saying that marijuana has no medical utility whatsoever, that there's no evidence for this. It's not a medicine. And at the same time, DEA moved Marinol from Schedule 2 to Schedule 3 because it has no real diversion or abuse potential that warrants it being placed into Schedule 2. Implication being that it's a fairly safer medication. That's the active ingredient in whole marijuana. But we have our own FDA saying that there's no medicinal properties to this drug. Is it the sesame oil that the marijuana, that the THC is suspended in, that converts it into being a medicine? Why is, you know, how do we wrap ourselves around when there's polemics like this? And then the second part of the question.
Wait. Stop with one. Just stop with one with the question mark.
That's the first question.
Okay.
Well, that was a frustrating part for us as well when trying to make this documentary, because ultimately, you know, when you're doing a documentary like this, you want to have it be satisfying for people and not just have them left with a bunch more questions about all this. I think it was actually even earlier than the end of the Bush administration when some of what you're talking about really got codified in some ways, right? Where they took this, and I think it was 72, where they said this is now a Schedule 1 substance because of lack of evidence regarding its medical benefit. But even at the time that was decided, I think that the whole letter which I read said we anticipate that there will be evidence within the next year or so to look at this situation again, and that was 1972. So it never really got fully evaluated, I think, in a meaningful way at the level of Health and Human Services since that time. It's a long time ago. When you take out an active ingredient, like they did with Marinol, one active, pluck it out and essentially create a pharmaceutical drug, they took out THC and made this drug. Did it somehow change it in some way? And therefore they skirted around the issues of scheduling it in the same schedule as marijuana. And I think it's going to raise the question again, predicting the future, that as we do these whole plant extracts, like Staci's talking about, and create medications out of those, is that still Schedule I substance? Can you prescribe a Schedule I substance for a medical benefit? I mean, it's the most hypocritical thing. It's scheduled as a substance that has no medicinal benefit. Here's a prescription for it. I mean, that's essentially the unbelievable situation that we could be in, and it's happening because there are clinical trials going on in this country now with whole plant extracts of marijuana. So it's got to change in some way. And I think there's a lot of people who say marijuana should be scheduled down, should be a different scheduled substance.
Before your second question, I'm getting emotion, then I have to continue this way. Hold on. Did you have a question?
I do. Thank you, Dr. Gupta.
Sure, thank you.
My name is Renee Viome. I'm a master in public policy student here at the Kennedy School. You've talked primarily about the use of medical marijuana for conditions where other treatments haven't really worked. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the use of medical marijuana for chronic pain and whether or not you think that it can be a solution for changing, particularly here in the United States, the relationship people have with painkillers and overdose. And
yeah, no, it's a great question. I think that there's some real utility of cannabis for especially neuropathic chronic pain. That's the pain that, again, comes from nerve injuries and I know can be really difficult to treat. Sometimes narcotics can work. A lot of times patients are put on essentially medications that are nerve stabilizers, things that try and actually work on the nerve itself, but it's really, really difficult to treat pain. And I should point out, and I think maybe you're alluding to this idea that in this country, as things stand now, someone dies of an accidental prescription drug overdose every 19 minutes. These are accidental prescription drug overdoses, and usually it is narcotics. And we know that narcotic pain pills, typically people will start to develop a tolerance to these. So after a few months of taking these regularly, it won't work as well. And as a result, they take more. And they start to combine it with other medications, including alcohol. And that's a real prescription for disaster. We know, because I've researched this as part of the marijuana documentary, that the average time frame from the time of the first prescription to the time of death is 36 months. It's just 3 years. Most often these are people who've never taken pain pills before. They often go into the ER with back pain for the first time, and they're given a narcotic prescription. And if they're going to die, and again, every 19 minutes someone does die like this, it happens within 3 years. We know that marijuana can either help reduce the amount of pain medications, narcotics that people are taking, or have them not take any of these narcotics at all. And there have been studies on this, again, many of them in other countries. One of the big ones was in Israel, again, that we saw. But it's quite a remarkable situation. We didn't talk about that as much in the documentary because, again, I was really interested in this standing on its own merits. You know, the idea that we would compare this to narcotics and say narcotics has a really high risk profile where people die in this manner, and therefore marijuana is better because of that. I think it's interesting, but the idea to me was more interesting that marijuana should just stand on its own merits scientifically in terms of what it does in the body. And I apologize if that's hard for you to hear. I don't know, is this a personal thing for you?
No, not at all. I was just curious.
Okay, all right.
That's great.
Thank you.
Yes.
My name's Rohan Goel. I'm a student here at the college, and I was just curious to hear your thoughts on managing kind of the social impacts that medical marijuana sales and production have. I know in my home state of Colorado, there's municipalities that sell marijuana, see increases in crime, and they see businesses moving to other municipalities and moving out of state even to avoid the temptation, so to speak, of employees.
Yep. And what did you say the governor said recently?
So Governor Hickenlooper yesterday came out in the midst of, I guess, a debate and mentioned that he felt that Colorado's passage of recreational marijuana may have been, quote, reckless. in terms of, again, simply policy outpacing science. And many things we don't know, and they have social implications as well. So I think it's an incredibly important topic, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, there's two states, and Governor Hickenlooper sort of acknowledged when this happened, when this passed, that this was an experiment in so many ways for this country, and a lot of people are going to be looking to Colorado to see how it goes there, both in terms of the impact, the social impact, in terms of revenue for the state, which was a lot was made of that initially when it passed. But I think we're looking at something real time now, and seeing, other states may behave differently, but this is I think going to be an example, I think, for a lot of other states that are considering recreational marijuana, which is just Colorado and Washington.
Currently, right? Great question, then. Yes.
Hi, I'm Emily Venable. I'm a student here as well. Earlier, you mentioned how the Israeli doctor isolated a natural form of the cannabinoid in the body. I was wondering, is there a relationship between the diseases and the ailments that medical marijuana is helping and about the body's inability to synthesize this, or is it just that the medical marijuana is exacerbating the natural biological use of this cannabinoid in the body?
It's a great question, and Staci, I'd be interested to see what you have to say as well. I will point out that I was really fascinated by this idea that when you looked at head injuries or neuro injuries of some sort, part of the way that they started thinking about this was when they looked at these patients with head injuries and started looking at all the various things in the cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord, that some of these natural or endogenous cannabinoids were increased in amount. So the body was somehow starting to make the cannabinoids seemingly in response to whatever the injury was. Either, someone had a brain injury, they had a stroke, whatever it might be. And then from that, the idea was, well, if the body is doing this, if we supplement and give more, could it have additional benefit? So I think that was sort of the genesis of this idea of using some of these cannabinoids as a neuroprotectant, or even something that would decrease inflammation in the brain after an injury.
I think it's a great question. There have been some studies outside the U.S., one in particular that comes to mind that sort of resonates with what you're saying. In a cohort of patients with schizophrenia, patients were given either sort of a standard antipsychotic or they were given cannabidiol. And what they found was both things actually reduced psychotic symptoms. But in the patients who had cannabidiol, they had a far lower side effect profile. And in those patients only, there was a very clear relationship between the reduction of symptoms and increased anandamide levels. So it sort of speaks to your question quite nicely. In fact, there's clearly a synergy between them. So it's a great question. Thank you. We're working our way back here. Yes, I'm getting to you. Yes.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for the interesting discussion. My name is Peter Jackson. I'm one of the child psychiatry fellows here, and feel like I think about this in the context of what I see as a pretty vulnerable population. Being a strong believer in science, it makes me slightly uncomfortable to think about policy and that moving forward, outpacing science. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit on what is the velocity difference between how fast policy is moving and how fast science is moving? And I guess my question is, can science catch up and make sure that we make safe decisions if policy is moving at the velocity that it's at and maybe not slow down?
Yeah. It's a great question, and the context, as Staci sort of said, is that there's been a sort of pendulum swing here, right? It hasn't been just sort of a natural trajectory. At one point in this country, again, we did have cannabis on the pharmacopoeia, the book that we doctors look at to prescribe medications, and we know its history in a lot of other countries around the world. Policy outpacing science, I think, sort of affects things both ways. We're seeing it at the state level, where states are just deciding that, we're not going to wait for the science because it's taking too long, or there's too many barriers in place to actually get the science done, so we're just going to do this ourselves. So you could see how the science is slowed down at the same time because of policy. So states deciding on their own, but then the policies and the laws that we have in this country make it really challenging for the science to get done. It's hard to basically go and study something that has already been preordained as having no medicinal benefit, and conducting a study that tries to show its medicinal benefit. It's hard in so many ways, from the approvals that you need to get, from the ability to actually obtain the substrate, the marijuana, for study. There's just a lot of challenges. So I would say for the time being, I think the science is improving. There are more trials that are getting done probably than ever before. Staci used the word watershed moment, in our history now in terms of what's happening with scientific research, but it's still being outpaced, I think, by policy. That the equation is still not balanced, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. That's a great question. Well, thank you. Yes, I'm coming. Yes.
Hi. I'm Jeff Hoffman. I'm actually not a student here with a friend. I'm a family physician. And, I've seen the science outpace the policy, and I just wonder if anyone on the policy end, or if anyone from the scientific community has addressed anybody to help them generate someone who can help them with the policy, since it seems to be very non-scientific.
I mean,
No, I think it's a good point, and I think it's something that everybody's sort of struggling with at the same time. So how do we begin to make strides with regard to having science catch up with policy, sort of dovetailing on the last question?
And let me say that there's a nuance, I think, to that as well, and that is that look, there's a lot of stigma around this issue at all levels. I mean, I remember after we made the first documentary, I got calls from people. Leaders in medicine, judges, including federal judges, politicians, many politicians who wanted to have these conversations all off the record, do not identify me, and tell me what they believed with regard to the potential of medical marijuana, and in some cases even what medical marijuana had done for themselves or loved ones. And it was quite striking, almost jarring a little bit, because it was almost like I was running a marijuana confessional all of a sudden. But the stigma, aside from the policy and the science, the stigma it's a real issue, and I think even there's scientists who may believe that there's real legitimacy here, but will stay away from this topic because they just don't want to deal with the stigma that's going to come with it. Politicians are unlikely to run on this issue because, as much as they may believe in it, they don't know that they're ever going to win on it. And so, as a result, it just sort of stalls. As much momentum as it may have, even as the scientific evidence builds, that's going to be a big cross to bear. I think it's going to be a challenging one. And again, for me, it's one of these things. What pushed me more into reporting this was the idea that it seemed morally wrong to not have something available that could help when nothing else has. I think a lot of these patients try everything already for these various conditions and they don't get any relief. And as I said, I too easily, I think, dismissed all of them as malingerers who were just simply trying to get high. And there is a fair amount of that.
I see it too.
Yeah. And
if medical marijuana was legalized in North Carolina, I don't think I would prescribe it, because I'm not sure I want somebody who may be coming to me just as a malingerer, somebody who just wants the drug. I got that problem already with chronic pain, and I don't know if I want that burden with marijuana.
Certainly a huge problem for so many people making these decisions.
Yeah.
We could have a back and forth on that.
Yes, we could.
And actually, I'm going to interrupt here for just a second because I see that we're now at 7:08. Do we have time for one last question? Is that okay? I'm getting the yay sign. It's a hard one. I have somebody who didn't have a question yet, but you can ask your question right after.
We could maybe do both.
My name is Dr. Yasmin Mashoon. I'm also an addiction neuroscientist at McLean Hospital. I see we're well represented here tonight. So my question is, it's sort of actually follow up a little bit on the one just now. What sort of prescriptive thresholds do you think should exist for physicians in terms of prescribing medical marijuana? Particularly because I think there's been a lot of reports of the ease of acquiring the medical marijuana. Yeah, the medical marijuana card. I mean, definitely out of California and Colorado, it seems like you can just go and just get, oh, my arm hurts, and you just get one. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are as to what the burden of proof maybe should be, or what sort of prescriptive threshold should exist.
It's a tough question, and it doesn't come up with just marijuana. Obviously, it comes up with lots of different medications, notably narcotics. We deal with that a lot, and pain is, it's a difficult thing to measure. You'd wish that you could objectify this in some way. I don't know. I don't know. It's a real problem. I think that there are a lot of people who obviously abuse the system, and that abuse exists with marijuana and it exists with other medications. I almost in some ways ask the reverse question, which I imagine you may have considered as well, which is that what is the price you're willing to pay to deny somebody a therapy that could potentially be beneficial to them? And would you raise the thresholds knowing that you might start to exclude patients who could get benefit, who will suffer now because of these increased thresholds? And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that.
At what stage do you think that medical marijuana then should other medications, therapeutics be tried first and then perhaps bring it to medical marijuana? Or where do you think in the, I guess so. Maybe on an individual basis?
No, well, I think so. Like, I gave the example of, Charlotte, this little girl. I mean, she had done the ladder of the various anti-epileptic drugs. And ultimately, we may get to the point in this country where we realize that this may be a less risky proposition to do this. We're not there yet. So because of that, I think you try the things that have actually gone through an FDA approval process first. I would think. I know that's not what always happens, obviously. There's a lot of people who get their cards far too easily, which is the point that you're making. But if you're serious about the science and serious about this potentially as a medicine, ultimately I think this gets treated the way that any other medicine gets treated. And when we actually have science that can be conducted and looked at and agreed upon and published in journals, and it takes away some of the stigma surrounding this, I think we can more easily get to the point where we can establish those thresholds. And you know what? It's not going to work for all these things that are currently on the list. And that'll be something that needs to be told to people. They can't get it for every single thing that currently is on a lot of those lists. So
it's a great question. Thank you. So again, we could go on about this for hours, and unfortunately we can't. We're out of time. But I'd like to thank the JFK Forum for hosting us, and our esteemed guest, Dr. Gupta, for spending time with us tonight in this discussion. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks for being here, everybody. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.